God bless America. Hello, everybody. I am the Talk Radio Protege. This is a special Saturday edition of the Protege program. Thank you so much for taking some time out of the weekend to pay a little bit of attention to politics. Today, of course, is the impact of overturning Roe versus Wade video. First of all, if you watched all 2 hours of myself reading reading Justice Blackmun's Roe versus Wade opinion, thank you. Sincerely, thank you so much because I know that must have been painful for some of you to watch. I mean, reading 2 hours worth of Justice Blackmun's opinion is insanely difficult, but I can only imagine what listening to it must have been like. Thank you so much for making it through that. This video is kind of reflecting on Roe versus Wade a little bit in terms of what it did, the legality that it laid out, the effective legislation that it laid out, and what would happen if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned. So, if you made it to the last 20 minutes of the second hour of the Roe versus Wade video, you know what Roe versus Wade did. The law that it effectively laid out. I specifically called out that that good paragraph and a half or so of opinion as legislation from the bench. It is perhaps the most explicit legislation from the bench that has been ever been put to paper. Because what Blackmun did was he made legislative decisions and then made those decisions law by the virtue of rendering his opinion. Now, if Roe versus Wade, the letter of the law of Roe versus Wade, had been written into legislation and passed, we would have had a very different discussion, I think. At the time that Roe versus Wade happened, I don't think that a piece of legislation that was written like Roe versus Wade would have been successful. I think that it also would have been stricken down as too obscure. Is that the word I'm looking for? Maybe obscure is not quite the right word. Ambiguous, that's the word I'm looking for. Because viability is a term that was introduced into U.S. law for the first time by Roe versus Wade. And viability really is, even today, becoming a more and more variable term. In the days that Roe was originally decided, viability was probably a lot less variable. Of course, I'm not an expert in medical history, so I can't say for sure what the premature infant mortality rates were during that time, but I can imagine that viability was a lot more uniform across the United States of America. But today, thanks to the concentration of extremely advanced medical knowledge and the advancement of that extremely advanced medical knowledge, viability is a much more variable term than probably than it used to be. The example that I've heard cited before is that a baby born prematurely in New York City is much more viable than a baby born at the same time period in, say, West Virginia. You're still on the East Coast, but the differences in technology and expertise available in New York City compared to West Virginia means that babies are viable at a much earlier stage thanks to advances in medical technology. So viability is really a bad term to be used in a legislative law, much less a Supreme Court opinion. Something else that Blackmun did as part of his opinion was he made several, I called them arbitrary decisions, And I might be using a definition of arbitrary that's different from what a lot of other people use, but basically, many decisions are arbitrary in that there is there while there might be rationale to the decision ultimately that must be made uh, is not as oh is not as driven as one might expect. So what I mean by that is, um, if someone's holding a gun to your head and they say, "Do this or you will die," that's much less of an arbitrary decision as deciding what the value of x is going to be in an imaginary algebraic equation that you're making up. If I wanted to write an algebraic equation to give to someone to solve, now every decision that you would make, uh, or at least the very first decision that you would make, is totally arbitrary. Uh, which, which is to say that you're making a decision and there is no real driving factors to why you made that decision. And Blackman made some decisions that I call arbitrary, and there is rationale to it, but it's extremely subjective rationale, and it's why I call it arbitrary, because a different person would with different beliefs would have made a very different decision than Blackman ended up making for the Roe versus Wade decision. Now, let's talk about the actual letter of the law and what it established. I say letter of the law, the letter of the opinion, and what it established as law so far as the federal level goes. Blackman wrote that in the first trimester, the opinion of the medical professional attending to the woman was to rule in the scenario. There's nothing the state could say. The state was not allowed to regulate abortion in the first trimester, according to Roe versus Wade. This would mean that Joe Schmuck, your next door neighbor, could perform an abortion on you in the first trimester, and there's nothing the state could do about it. In the second trimester, Blackman allowed that the state was allowed to regulate abortion on behalf of protecting the health of the mother. Now, that is to say that the states are not allowed to ban abortion in the second trimester. All that they are allowed to do is to make abortion safer for the mother. The mother's will, in that sense, is still to rule even in the second trimester. It's only the third trimester that Blackman allows, well, really not even then, it's viability that Blackman allows is the moment at which the state is allowed to intervene on behalf of an unborn child. Now, before Roe versus Wade, what was the federal law? Well, there was none. There was no federal statute that dictated rules for abortion, regulations for abortion, or what states were allowed to do, or anything like that. So the laws on the books concerning abortion before Roe versus Wade were on a state-by-state basis. Each state was allowed to decide what it was going to do about abortion. That is the federalism system of government, which the United States was founded upon. And essentially what Blackman did, thanks in part to the 14th, the Supremacy Clause of the 14th Amendment, was say that the federal government was going to override the will of the states on the issue of abortion. And I've referenced the 14th Amendment and the Supremacy Clause a lot in this series of videos. Perhaps it deserves a video in and of itself. But what the Supremacy Clause does is basically say that the federal government has the final say, period. Federal laws override state laws, not the other way around, as I believe was the original intent of the founders. The original intent of the founders was that the federal government was supposed to be so small that if anybody who worked for the federal government or was a member of the federal government wanted to exert their will over the American people, they would have zero power to do so because the states had that jurisdiction. The only place that the federal government was supposed to be able to exercise control was over dealings between the states, and as essentially the representative of the states to the other nations of the world. The United States of America does not mean the United Municipalities of America. It means that the states that comprise the United States of America are sovereign states. And if, essentially, the 14th Amendment, with its supremacy clause, obliterated that. So, Blackmun then, using his position as a member of the Supreme Court and as a voting member of the majority in Roe versus Wade, decides that he's going to use the supremacy clause to say, here are the rules for everyone in the United States of America, all of the states, all of the people that live in the states. So if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, what would happen? What would be the fallout? One political commentator who I've mentioned a couple of times, I mentioned in hour 2 of the Roe versus Wade video briefly, and I think I'll spend some more time talking about it here, Tomi Lahren. She has what I call the most unique and precarious of opinions on abortion. But she has strongly urged, very passionately urged, conservatives not to say that we're coming for Roe versus Wade, not to gun for Roe versus Wade per se. She said, we shouldn't be sending a message that we're sending a Supreme Court justice to, that we're sending a justice to the Supreme Court to perform religious judicial activism. Now, I think it goes without saying that one can be opposed to Roe versus Wade on secular grounds. I think I have made that case multiple times on this channel, and I'm a person that is opposed to Roe versus Wade on religious grounds as well. You don't have to make the argument from religious grounds, but it seems that to Tomi Lahren, the only objection to abortion is religious. Just far from the case, but at risk of lingering on the details, allow me to move on. Tomi Lahren seems to be very concerned about overturning Roe v. Wade, and so I would just want to talk about what would happen if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned. Let's say that Roe v. Wade never happened in the first place. What would be the state of abortion laws in this country? Well, it would have evolved with the cultures and political climates of the states that it was in. The laws in Texas probably would not have changed. Likewise, for states like maybe Oklahoma, maybe Colorado, maybe Montana, maybe the Dakotas, maybe the South, maybe the Midwest. Those states probably wouldn't have changed their laws. But over time, some states in the United States have become much more liberal on the idea of abortion, much more left-leaning, let's say, rather than liberal. And so those states would have changed their laws over time to be more allowing of abortion. And you really only have to look at the political climate of the states as they are today to understand what abortion laws would look like, would have evolved like if Roe versus Wade had never happened. But it did happen, so let's say that Roe versus Wade is overturned. What would happen? Would abortion automatically become illegal in all 50 states? Well, no, that's not quite the case. Really what would happen is that the question of what abortion means, what it means to procure an abortion, what viability is, what an unborn child is when life begins, all of those questions would fall back to the states. And there would be some states that I can think of, a couple off the top of my head, that would absolutely pass the most liberal, the most progressive abortion laws that they could possibly dream up. Washington, Oregon, California, New York, New Hampshire, Delaware, I don't know, Connecticut maybe. these states would not allow abortion to fade into obscurity, out of existence. Now, for sure, there would probably be many states. There would probably be vast stretches of acreage, hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles that some individuals would have to travel if they wanted to procure an abortion. You know, somebody in North Dakota that wanted to get an abortion would probably have to get on a plane and go to New York to get one, because that's going to be the closest abortion clinic that they can get to. But if you're going to talk about access in those terms, you're really getting off into the feminazi perspective on access. You're getting off into the socialist perspective on access as well, because these people define access as getting something for free. I live in a town where there is, oh, what should we use as our example? There is a store where you can go and buy Magic the Gathering cards. And me, as a not progressive person, considers that to be access. I have to go and spend money, but I can get Magic the Gathering cards. But to progressives, that is not access. Access means getting it for free. So what's something that we don't have? We don't have in the town that I live in a Bass Pro Shop, but about 80 miles from where I live, there is a Bass Pro Shop. So to the progressives, this again is not access, because I have to drive 80 miles to get to a Bass Pro Shop, and not everybody can afford to drive 80 miles. So there really needs to be, if there's not an abortion clinic within 15 miles of where you live, you don't have access. If there's not a free abortion clinic within 15 miles of where you live, you don't have access in the minds of the feminazis. So the question of access cannot be the question. We're dealing with people far too extreme to worry about access as the states would move forward in crafting their legislation. So, if Roe v. Wade is overturned tomorrow, does abortion cease to exist in the United States? No. Will the Planned Parenthood clinics in the states that would be most likely to ban abortion altogether shut down overnight? No. There would be some time. There's the legislative process that these states would have to go through. There's the implementation process these states would have to go through. There would probably be grandfather clauses that it would be included in some legislation. Abortion would not disappear from the Bible Belt in the Deep South overnight. There might even be many states in the South and the Bible Belt that would leave provisions open for abortion practices to be continued under strict circumstances. So no, for people like Tommy Lahren that are worried about people coming after Roe versus Wade, you are allowed to object to Roe versus Wade on secular grounds. The only objection to Roe versus Wade is not religious based. There are more than one. The people that are worried about abortion disappearing overnight if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, it's not true. It's not going to happen. As far as people worried about Roe versus Wade being overturned, obliterating abortion in the United States altogether, not going to happen. California and New York are not going to allow abortion to disappear from the United States. You're not going to have to go to Mexico to get your abortion, although that might be the shortest distance for some of you to travel. There will be abortion available in the United States, even if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned. That's going to do it for this video. Again, thank you for taking some time out of your Saturday to have this discussion with me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you'll come back next time. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video. Hit subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so that you don't miss future videos. Until next time, good night, enjoy your weekend, and God bless.